Yes.
Er du klar?
Okay, we are about to start with the next talk. It's Lasse, who's going to talk a bit about GDPR.
And customs. Thank you very much. And thank you for having me. So I'm going to talk about privacy and GDPR in relation to customs in Denmark and the EU, and more specifically the new requirements to have a much more data-driven customs in both Denmark and the EU. So yes, and I started in this business about 3 months ago, so there's still a lot of new stuff for me. But first of all, before we have to talk about privacy and GDPR, we need to talk a little bit about how customs is in the EU and what is going on in the EU at the moment, as well as the Danish perspective on that. And then we can go and look into some of the privacy and GDPR related things that we're dealing with. And then I thought to end it with a case study that really highlights, for me at least, the interesting challenges we have in intersection between law and technology, especially in the right to explanation part of the GDPR. GDPR. That was. Okay, so the history of customs in Europe is in a really coarse way depicted here. We have in 68 an agreement about a common market within the European Union. And then in 92 there was some work to harmonize the legislation in all the member states in the European Union, so we could have a much more homogeneous customs legislation. The problem was, though, that although the law might be quite similar in all the member states, then all member states implemented it in their own IT systems and with their own custom processes and so on. So in reality, there's a big difference on whether you import goods into Denmark or into Germany or wherever. And this is what was then tried to be addressed in 2016 when the European Union made the so-called Union Customs Code, UCC, or in Danish terminology, it's Europæisk Toldkodex, EUTK, which should try and make even more, make the customs processes even more harmonized throughout the European Union. So some of the goals of this Union Customs Code is to yes, as I said, streamline all the custom processes, and specifically try to reduce the administrative burden on AEOs, which AEOs is authorized economic operators, which are importers, exporters, for instance, that have done some additional certification and validation, and thus have some advantages compared to non-AEOs. I know that in Denmark it's actually perhaps just as cumbersome to be an AEO as being a non-AEO, which is definitely not the whole point of this constellation, so there's definitely work to be done here. Then there's also still a lot of paper in the customs procedures, so it's been highlighted that the goal is to go for paperless customs, so it should all be digital. However, of course, there will probably be some corner cases where it's not possible, but at least that's a goal. Another thing is to have a data model covering the entire customs processes There's the World Custom Organizations, which have made a huge data model of customs, and the EU took that and made their own model based on that. So that's a model we have to use in our systems as well. And then, of course, we would like to share more data, which is really relevant today. So there should be more data sharing and improved security. And security here means security with respect to all the goods that we get into the borders of the EU. So we should try to get less illegal stuff into the European Union. So in the Danish perspective, when this UCC came, it contains a lot of deadlines that needs to be that we need to abide by. And we have a huge custom organization already, so to try and map what needs to be done to the present situation, so on, is quite a work. And so Deloitte was hired to do an analysis of this and come up with some recommendations on how we tackle the UCC in Denmark. And the present systems landscape in the Danish customs is quite complex. I have, just to illustrate coarsely, a figure that illustrates all the different systems in the Danish customs, which is all the green boxes are customs systems, and all the blue ones are different systems which within the government, and all the brownish are external systems. For instance, up here we have all the EU systems where we get data from the European Union. And all these lines you can see are all kinds of connections between the systems. And as you can see, it's quite chaotic at the moment, which is partly because this has been made continuously over several years. So each time a new upgrade needed to be made or something, and they needed data from another system, they just made some connection there with a FTP or web service or something like that. So at the moment it's quite chaotic. Yeah. So some of the recommendations that came out of this analysis was, first of all, to make the place where I work, namely the Implementation Center for Customs, or Implementering Center for Told, as it's called in Danish, ICT, which should be a separate organization within the Ministry of Finance, which should deal with this UCC compliance and getting the Danish customs to be UCC compliant. And one of the consequences of the analysis of all the systems that I showed you before is that almost all of them needs to be replaced. If it's all, or there are a few systems that will survive, I'm not entirely sure, and it's still being debated, but at least there's a huge makeover of the entire systems landscape in our Danish customs organization. And then of course we also need to, and that was a recommendation, that we should, now that we are giving this whole systems landscape a makeover, let's try and do this, make a more data-driven customs, as the UCC also requires. Within the ICT, we have a department in data and analytics, which is basically split into two teams. One of them is the data modeling. That's a thing I really have underestimated when being engaged in a huge IT project like this, and that is how important the data modeling and data governance actually are. So there's a lot of my colleagues dealing with making huge diagrams of all the data and finding out all the metadata for all the data and so on, because one of the things that usually go wrong in these huge projects is if there's not a proper mapping of all the data and who's responsible for what data and so on, then we end up in a situation where if some modification needs to be done, and that of course will happen in the future, then we don't know who's responsible and how to do and how it affects the system and everything. So we have some guys working with exactly that. And also this is an illustration of one of the, or part of the database schema of one of the systems. it's really complex, and that's, I think, 1 page out of 4. Yeah, but I'm in the analytics department, and there are different tasks we have to tend, but one of the more important one is, of course, the machine learning part. And specifically, we have machine learning on risk. And risk means whenever we get a package or shipment from somebody, we would like to have some sort of algorithm that could, based on all the data we have, try to assess are there anything that shouldn't be in this shipment on this package. It could be everything from guns or illegal drugs to a declaration that is invalid. So we also have a huge problem with people making declarations, for instance, in import, that they make mistakes because it's a very complicated process, and we would like to detect that as well and try to help people. So there's a lot of machine learning potential here, and there's a lot of data sources to try and use. Which bring us to the important part, namely, if we're going to use all this data, how are we going to do that, and what are the legislation in this area? And I would like to say first that I'm not a law person, and we have, of course, I have some colleagues that have a law background, and having some discussion with these people is always interesting, because you say something, you use a word a bit casually, and then they are really, no, that's not really, the right way of saying this, and then it turns out that this word you used casually have a very specific meaning in law language, so I might say something that is not entirely correct, and so on. So this is just from a layman's perspective. Yes, and then in general, all this discussions about how do we deal with data, how do we deal with machine learning in well, I guess both private and in government. In the government, it's very much work in progress. I know at the moment there's a huge guideline book being made, and it's up in the higher spheres of the ministry at the moment, being reviewed, which sort of try to provide some guidelines on what we can and what we cannot do when we are doing machine learning in the government. And when I talk to law people, they say that in general this is really new, and both nationally but also in the EU, to how to tackle all these data and algorithms and so on. But there are already a lot of pre-GDPR regulations that we need to abide by. When we are going to use some data that is not our own, we always need to have a written and signed data processing agreement, which specify what is the justification for using these data and who have the responsibility and so on and so forth. So it's formally written down who's responsible. And that's something we have been working on at the moment, to get such an agreement so we can actually get a hold of some data. And then of course, and this holds not only for us, but in general also if researchers want to use some of the government data, that you should state the uses and the reasons why you want to use some specific personal data. And it's not just enough to write for science. You need to be much more specific and actually write what are the data used for. And of course, one of the important points here is that when you do that, it will also be clear what data is relevant to your research, for instance, and what is not. So it's not like if you need some personal data and that resides in, let's say, some table in some database somewhere, then you will not get access to the entire, to all the columns in the table if it's not relevant to you. So that's one of the very important restrictions. And then there's restriction in what data we can actually use when we're doing profiling and doing machine learning, and I will come back to that later. because we cannot just use all the data. Then there's a requirement now to use anonymized data. If possible, there might be some cases where you need to work with non-anonymized data. But I think in all of our cases, we can actually work with anonymized data. Of course, this is where technology and technical considerations begin to play a role in all the law, because what means anonymized data? I mean, let's say we have some data on companies where we have some CVR numbers, we have some addresses and so on. Of course, we can anonymize each column. We could, for instance, take the hash plus salt and then use the result of that in our analysis and thus work with anonymized data. But there will of course be outliers that you can detect some way or another if you have a large enough data. For instance, there would be some huge Danish companies which would probably be easy to identify doing some very easy statistical analysis. But if we try to shuffle the data to sort of prevent this, then we will perhaps not be able to use it for machine learning purposes and so on. So where do you draw the line? That's a very good question. And it can be quite tricky, because you can apply a lot of advanced statistical methods to try and identify something in a otherwise anonymized data set. I know a case some years ago with Netflix that made a competition, which some of you might have heard of, where they anonymized a lot of data and made a competition to try and improve their own machine learning model and said to the internet, please have a go at this. And then some scientists worked on the data and actually claimed, I haven't read the papers they wrote, but they claimed to actually be able to identify some people in this data set. So this really highlights the challenges involved in this. Yes. Then there's of course a requirement to delete data as soon as you're done with it. It's you're not allowed to just store it for a nice to have kind of basis. So you have to delete this immediately after. Once again, delete. For many people, delete is just dragging it into a bin on the desktop. But we know that, of course, deleting data can be a quite complicated process. For instance, if you have a copy on write file system or stuff like that. So how do you properly delete, and what is a sufficient deletion of data? There's also, of course, the whole aspect of backups and so on. So once again, something that could be quite simple in layman's terms can be a technical challenge. And then, of course, we have to have some security measures, not just technical, but also on the organizational level. We need to have some responsible people and so on, and that has to be part of your requirements. So when GDPR came and I asked some of the law people where I work, so how far are we? They said, well, if we are compliant now, then we are almost compliant with the GDPR. So that I think is at least good news, that the law we already have is so strict, at least from the government perspective. I don't know how it is for private companies. We might know more about that tomorrow when there's a panel debate. However, there are different requirements which I've seen recognized as new requirements for the GDPR. First of all, I've read many places on the internet that now the definition of personal data has been widened, but when I talk to the law people, they say, well, for us that's how it is already. For instance, IP addresses. Also, there's a requirement if you have enough personal data that you should make a privacy impact assessment, which means try to say, okay, if there's a breach happened, what would the impact be on privacy of the involved data subjects? And that we already have as well within the government, although it might be tightened, but I'm not sure about the details yet. And then we have privacy by design, which require us to to think privacy in our infrastructure from day one. And at least in my department, that's definitely what we're doing at the moment. Other requirements are that now you need to have a data protection officer, which is a person in your organization which have the responsibility of protecting data, but have some immunity. You cannot just fire this person for doing the job and so on. So there's a lot of requirements. And I know that the Ministry of Finance is going to employ one centrally within the ministry that will take care of that. And then there's also another requirement with the violation fee, which I've seen in the EU, that if a also private company can actually have a quite large fee if they violate the GDPR. I think at the moment in Denmark and the government institutions don't have this fee, because whether or not government institutions should be penalized this way is up to the member states to decide. And I think at the moment, in Denmark at least, it's leaning towards no fee. And then there's the right to explanation, which I will come back to in a minute. It's also been very debated addition to the GDPR. So, I mentioned earlier that we are forbidden to use certain kind of data in our modeling. And I took this small quote, and I'm sorry it's in Danish, I will translate. But it's from a personal data law that we have here in Denmark, and which we have to abide by where I work. And it says that you cannot process information about race, ethnicity, political or religious or philosophical views, relations to union, and information about health or sexual orientation and stuff like that. So we are not allowed to use that. Which of course make perfect sense. We cannot have racist models. And it also means, of course, that we need to have some sort of process and infrastructure that where each time we have a model ready, then it should be clear that we are not using any features that is not allowed. So that makes me happy as a privacy person and as a citizen. But when we discuss the technical details, when me and my colleagues do this, we run into some problems. For instance, what features can we use? What kind of data can we use in the models? Of course, there will be a lot of no-brainers where we know this is definitely off limits, but there might be features that are somewhere in a gray zone. And more importantly, what if we know of a feature that is quite innocent, but that actually correlates with one feature that is off limits? How do we tackle that? That is some of the questions that we are trying to address at the moment. And then there's the big one, which is the right to explanation, which is written in the new EU legislation. And I've also seen this being debated a lot, because how do we do this? But basically it says that if you as a person is subject to some model in some by a private or public company, and it make a decision that have some sort of impact on you, then you can say to that organization, well, I would like to know what was the basis of that decision. How did the algorithm come to this decision? And I think, once again, as a citizen, that seems like a very good idea, but how do we implement it? Because if we are losing some of the more standard modeling techniques like linear models and decision trees, then in many cases it can be actually quite easy to identify all the features that are really important in making a decision, making a particular decision. So for instance, in our case, let's say a package was opened and the citizen who had ordered this package would like to know what was the basis of this. then if we use linear models or decision trees, I think I would come with a good answer and say this and this and this parameter was what contributed to the decision that your package should be flagged. However, there are much more complicated models like neural networks or support vector machines using nonlinear kernels and so on. And then all of a sudden it becomes a huge problem in deciding what was the actual basis for the algorithm. And I know this is not just something that we are considering a lot, it's also being discussed in the SCAT organization, where they are taking this very seriously to figure out what can we actually do and what is a sufficient explanation we can give if people ask. And one of the things that come up is an article, Why Should I Trust You? Which is sort of come up with a algorithm to try and take some sort of huge machine learning model that is really complicated and you as a human being cannot wholly understand the connection between the inputs and the outputs. So it's sort of a black box. Then you can try and use this algorithm to try and approximate for one particular application of this model. You can try and see, okay, what was the most important features used. So they have this picture here where you have a very complex model. You have a lot of data that you fed into the model. And then it makes a decision, in this case, whether or not a person is sick or not. And then the whole point is, of course, to have an algorithm that can identify some of the important features. And what it basically does is, if you have a black box model and you have some sort of data point where you apply this model, then you try to look at all the meaningful features in your model, because you can have a lot of non-meaningful features if they have been processed some way or another. So you take all the meaningful features of your model, and then you make some Monte Carlo simulations around your point where you sample and perturb the data point, and then try to use a much more simple linear model to fit. And then you try to optimize over the complexity of the model and how good it fits to the original model. But once again, what is a good fit, and is it sufficient to give this as an explanation? That is still an open question. But at least it highlights that there are some measures to be taken when we are trying to deal with this topic. So the concluding remarks from this talk is, of course, that the GDPR is not a big challenge for us because we are mostly compliant already. But GDPR and privacy in general have some interesting intersections between law and technology, and I think this is still a very much a gray area. I try to lean towards the privacy part, and the colleagues I work with have the same tendency, so we try to see what is really the intention with this, but there are definitely some gray areas. And then, of course, there's the possibility to actually develop some technologies that can help us in being compliant with the law. So with this, I would say thank you for your attention. And we are still hiring data scientists, so if you want to come aboard, please let me know. Thank you.
Do we have any questions for Lasse?
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I am a bit curious about what are the risks for an entity like the one that you work for in not complying with GDPR. Well, like what happens if you don't even care about it? Because yeah, there are pretty strong national regulations anyway. So is it relevant to you at all?
If it's relevant,
Yeah, yeah. Like, why do you even care about it if, you know, there are no fines to be applied to you? Yeah.
well, as is, there's no fees, as you say, for us, but there are definitely consequences if we do not comply with the law. I mean, in the end, you can be fired if you violate the law or if you are completely oblivious to privacy considerations. I know actually of a Danish case recently where the statsrevisorerne, I don't know how to translate that, but they have been out and have some really harsh critique of SCAT because they have not follow up, because they have these data processing agreements with some of the vendors that is maintaining their systems, and they have not tried to investigate whether they abide by these requirements in the agreement. And then when an organization like Statsrevisorerne does this, it makes a lot of attention and will have some consequences for the people not doing it. So I guess that's at least one of the things that you have to think about if you are violating these requirements. And I know from personal experience that where I work, there are some people hired to care about this, and they really do. So yeah. Yes, internally, and that is what is going to be expanded with the data protection officer that is going to be employed as well.
Other questions? None? Let's give Lasse a round of applause.